Hello, everyone, and welcome to Incorporating Dynamic Assessment into Evaluations. My name is Andrea Bertoni. I am the Speech and Language and Related Service Consultant at DPI. I've been here for about 3 years, and before that, I worked in a large school district for about 18 years. I'm joined today with Lisa Kirby-Mangus and Marie Werka, who are both in Madison Metropolitan School District, and I am going to let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Lisa Kirby-Mangus, and I practice speech pathology in the Madison Metropolitan School District. And I've worked here for a number of decades, and I've worked at every level from early childhood through post-high school. So I'm so happy to be here with you today.
My name is Marie Werka, and I'm also very happy to be here with you today. I was born in Milwaukee and grew up in Madison. I've worked for the Madison School District for about 6 years as a bilingual SLP, and I have also worked for bilinguistics in Austin, Texas for about 6 years, and worked on learning Spanish in Mexico for 2 years. It's very nice to be here with all of you.
Awesome. I wanted to give a quick thank you to the Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative, better known as WISPE, for letting us use their Zoom account today. A few housekeeping items. In the participant folder, you're going to find the Google slide deck, as well as 2 other handouts that you're going to need today. And we ask that if you have any questions today, you feel free to put them in the Padlet. If you look on the handout, or Daniel might put that in the chat for you, but there is a space for you to capture your questions. We're not quite sure. We have a lot of content for you today. And if we aren't able to answer your questions, we will come up with a way to answer those questions and get the answers back to you. I wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement to recognize the people who were stewards before us, the Indigenous people. You are joining us from various places around the state, so I'll just take a second and look at where you are and what Indigenous peoples were there before you. I'm just going to briefly pause. There's some resources on this that are some links if you want to look at a more interactive map or more in-depth information around the Native American tribes in Wisconsin. At DPI, educational equity means students get what they need when they need it. I know that what I'm saying is shorter than what is on here, but in a nutshell, that's the guiding principle at the Department of Public Instruction. And what that means is that we need to think about what actions that we're taking to support underserved students and families, to maintain and deepen relationships with those students and families, to focus on collaboration in our decision making, to make sure we take into account individual student and family needs. We want to make sure that we maximize the least restrictive environment as much as possible and have that be with general education peers as much as is appropriate. And then also, we want to make sure that as practitioners, we're practicing self-care so that what we are able and available to support others. We have 3 major learning objectives for today, our dynamic assessment webinar. Our hope is that you will gain an understanding in what dynamic assessment is and how it can fit into your current assessment practices. That you'll gain familiarity with dynamic assessment case examples that we provide to you. And we also hope that you will identify some resources that you can use to explore this topic further. So that being said, I'd like to start with this quote from IDEA. In which it says that the evaluation should be sufficiently comprehensive to identify the child's special education and related service needs, whether or not commonly linked to the disability impairment category in which the child has been classified. And so at DPI, we've been focusing the last couple of years, as you may know, on comprehensive evaluation. And so that is the frame that we're coming at this work today. And if you've come to my my sessions at the CISA 5 Institute or at WISHA, you will know that I've been sharing this from Marie Ireland at the Virginia Department of Ed, this comprehensive assessment model, right? So it's not enough just to look at our norm referenced assessments, and rather IDEA calls us to look at other domains. And so this really, I think, is a great model that we should be looking at information from all these different quadrants. And as you can see, dynamic assessment is explicitly called out under speech language probes. And it is in our current technical assistance guide. And we need to look at all these different quadrants because there are limitations of norm referenced assessments. And Kate Crowley from the Leaders Project, which is out of Columbia University, makes a couple of really good points in this link that I'm sharing with you. Norm reference tests assume that all children have had the same experiences and opportunities prior to evaluation, when it's clearly not the case, right? Kids come to us from all different kinds of backgrounds. Some kids have not ever seen anything like a norm reference test before. So, that can create its own sort of bias. And she then says, additionally, the skills evaluated by these tests are often more associated with culture or socioeconomic status, such as vocabulary, rather than a true language impairment. And I know I've had conversations with many of you over the last couple of years, and that's, you guys have seen that to be true. There's a couple of really good articles that have come out recently that talk a little bit more about considerations for students who are English learners. And of course, we also have IDEA talking about how we need to evaluate both languages for English learners unless it's not feasible to do so. But there's many recommendations in these articles around using a translator to obtain a case history from parents or caregivers in order to determine proficiency and extent of knowledge and use of home language. In addition, the recommendation is that you'd be interviewing school staff, including general education teachers and the ESL teachers, regarding language use across settings in the school environment. And the explicit call out in these articles around using dynamic assessment to determine the student's modifiability. And modifiability is a really big buzzword in dynamic assessment, and Marie is going to talk a lot more about that when she gets to her part of the presentation. And so we want to highlight that dynamic assessment is part of assessment. It's part of the evaluation process and what we're doing, our piece of assessment. That it's time limited, right? I think in one of the videos you watched for today, it could be one short session, it could be a couple of 30-minute sessions, but it's time limited. And it's an active process for both the student and the evaluator, right? It's engaging, there's back and forth, there's conversation. And then dynamic assessment determines the student's modifiability, which includes understanding and getting information about the present level of functioning, their learning potential, with an emphasis on the learning process, which is from ASHA, and then to support in goal development and the determination of student needs. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Lisa.
Thank you, Andrea. So dynamic assessment has the potential to reduce bias in the evaluations that we complete as speech language pathologists. The assumption is that when dynamic assessment is completed with children who have stronger language and perhaps not a speech and language impairment, the assessment will likely result in those children having that high level of modifiability that Andrea mentioned. In addition, with those same children who have that high level of modifiability, what we would expect is that there would be a low amount of speech language pathologist effort and scaffolding needed to work on that task. Dynamic assessment is a valuable resource because it reduces some of the biases that are inherent in those static norm referenced assessments. Perhaps a student has not had the opportunity to receive direct or explicit instruction or exposure to a task, and then dynamic assessment is very useful. It also helps us explore how much intervention a student would require to learn a task. So instead of focusing on the student's learning history, we focus on the learning process. And this incorporates the assumption that intelligence and learning may also be dynamic. So what is dynamic assessment? Dynamic assessment is evidence-based. As noted in a quote by Dr. Liz Pena, stronger language learners improve more than language learners with weaker language abilities at post-test and demonstrate higher modifiability during a mediated learning experience. So a mediated learning experience is a key part of dynamic assessment. After guided practice, students with stronger inherent language abilities tend to show marked improvement in performance or that modifiability. And dynamic assessment can be a key consideration that IEP teams can use when they're reviewing the eligibility checklist for speech and language during evaluations. Dynamic assessment is especially useful for students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and it's an important part of that four-step comprehensive assessment process that Andrea mentioned. Cultural differences could also be a consideration for students from rural areas who may be missing experiences or exposures that are presupposed on those static norm reference tests. And there is new evidence showing that dynamic assessment measurability does not vary based upon race, culture, age, or economics, making dynamic assessment a very viable and useful assessment tool. And the data that we could collect during dynamic assessment could be used for eligibility determination, to inform therapy, to write goals, and to measure progress.
So I want to just pause for a second and think about the terms static versus dynamic. And what exactly do those mean? How does that apply to our assessment? And so I did a little bit of digging and I looked at Wikipedia and I tried to come up with some clever examples. And so what I came up with is dynamic is responsive to the environment, to things that are happening around you. And so when I was thinking about characters, I was thinking about Harry Potter. He's very dynamic, right? For those of you who have read the books and seen the movies, Harry Potter is very dynamic versus Professor McGonagall, who's very static. Now she's a very strong character and she's a good character. So static isn't bad. It's just that there's a limitation. She is not changing over time. She is more static than Harry Potter in the books. And then another example is on the right, you will see the water and how it changes the landscape over time and how that is a very dynamic system, right? Over time, it's going to change versus the plateau on the side. And so hopefully, these examples and this last one, I really want to point out, like Instagram is the big thing for the teens right now, right? Very dynamic. And it changes based on your preferences and what you click versus my beloved speech and language DPI website. It's more static. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it doesn't change very much over time. And so, when we think about dynamic assessment, there's a place for both, right? But when we think about dynamic assessment, I hope you can see that there's going to be some value in thinking about how some interaction with students can add to the information that we're getting from static or norm referenced assessments.
So perhaps you're still feeling unsure about what dynamic assessment is. You're not alone. That's why we're here today. This is a quote from the Leaders Project, and it points to the value that clinical judgment has when speech language pathologists are completing assessments and providing speech and language services. An important fact to remember is that dynamic assessment is a method of conducting language assessment that seeks to identify the skills that a student possesses as well as their learning potential. Part of the critical information collected from dynamic assessment is how well a student performs after assistance. This assistance includes scaffolding, pardon me, which is the guidance or support to help a student push their ability to learn a new skill, to accomplish a new task, to build new knowledge, and build confidence, and increase their growth mindset. Clinical judgment comes into play when the SLP rates the amount and the kind of effort and support to enable that student's potential for change. And as speech language pathologists, we know how to use this clinical judgment. It is the same clinical judgment that we use when we provide services. A key part, as Andrea mentioned, of dynamic assessment is the mediated learning experience, so the MLE. During a mediated learning experience, we think about providing support within that zone of proximal development, which Vygotsky defines as the student's level or learning between what they know and what they do not know yet. So an MLE includes cognitive modeling in the inclusion of intentionality, meaning, transcendence, and competence. And Marie will discuss these more later. Basically, it includes the adult verbally modeling the thinking process, the problem solving, and the reasoning, with the hope that this leads to unvocalized thought or self-talk by the students. And remember, the goal of education is to support a child's growth while challenging their learning, and it's a collaborative process. So we want to know, what can a student learn with guidance from, as what Vygotsky labels, the more knowledgeable other, using that scaffolding, explicit or direct teaching, and exposure. Mediated learning experiences are also supported by Firestein's methods, which include that we are able to measure the ability to learn, and we are able to measure modifiability. Firestein also was renowned for his groundbreaking work in demonstrating that intelligence is not fixed, but it's modifiable. He believed we should teach the skill of learning how to learn. So using the data and our clinical judgment that we collect when completing a mediated learning experience, we can ask ourselves, what is the amount of intervention needed for that student to gain that skill? Vygotsky also believed that language was reinforced by social interaction. So an MLE gives us a glimpse into whether that social interaction and exposure is enough for a student to gain the target skill. So Marie will discuss more details about the mediated learning experience, but right now we will watch a short video of Dr. Liz Pena speaking about modifiability.